let's talk about the European Championship and prepare for the format a little bit. I want to do kind of a revision of the tier list that we have done at the beginning of this format a couple weeks ago. I want to look back at how we evaluated certain decks, certain hand traps, certain board breakers, or like tech cards in general, what I thought was gonna happen with them and what ended up actually happening. Maybe stuff that we overrated, stuff that we underrated, the situation of the current format. It's basically combining just a current meta discussion with looking back at what we thought in the beginning. I think it's going to be interesting. There's going to be some stuff in it to learn for Euros, because now we have seen all the nationals happen. We've seen a remote dual YCS happen. We've seen some of the World Championship qualifiers already happen, and we are as close as it gets to the European Championship. So let us revisit some of this stuff. In order to make a better evaluation of the board breaker and hand traps, I think we should start with the overall deck tier list that I made. And this is exactly the list that we ended up making. The cam is in the way of some of the decks, but I'll show them when I talk about them. On this one, I will say I did pretty well, especially looking at the top cut for German nationals, which was the most recent one. I feel like it did pretty well. The one thing I will say is, even though I did put Kashtira in tier 1, I put it lower than the other two. I underrated it probably. The main reason why I think I underrated Kashtira was I personally felt like a Rise Heart limit was a bigger deal than it ended up being. I feel like the Rise Heart limit actually wasn't that great of a hit. But still, Kashtira is obviously a top contender. And after all those nationals where Kashtira has been the most represented in top cut, I think it's fair to move Kashtira to the top of tier 1. Now, the rest though, I feel like in this tier 1 and tier 1.5 thingy, I feel like we nailed it on most of that stuff. If anything, we could move Branded down a little bit even. But the rest here, I think was pretty spot on. Like, you look at this breakdown, it's like Kashtira, Runic Sprite, Labyrinth, Rika, Sprite, some Furhire, some Branded, some Dragon Link. Like, literally, the top 2 rows are really the ones that are performing the best. So I am proud of myself for these first 2 rows in the tier list that I made. For me personally, I think the Runic Furhire deck is up here. I don't think these two are significantly better or worse than each other. I think both of them are great. Just based on representation, I think you need to leave the Life Twin deck a little bit higher because it's more popular. It's performing better because of that reason. I personally like the Furhire deck just as much, but just based on results, I think it's fair to leave it where it is. Melfi Sprite has been performing okay. Branded has been performing okay. Nothing more than that. It's not been good, actually, I don't think. Like, I think Branded is arguably not that great right now, but it is definitely not bad either. So I think it can remain here. Rika has been performing, unfortunately, you know, for yours truly, but Rika has been solid, and Dragon Link has also been solid. Oh, I will say, last time when I made this tier list, I forgot to put Vanquish Soul in there, and I couldn't just add it to this. Vanquish Soul I put in tier 2, and I think that's where it would stay. Just based on results, I would say Mathmech can go down to tier 3, just because it hasn't been doing shit. Plunder Runic hasn't been doing anything. Naturia Runic hasn't been doing anything. Super Heavy Samurai Pure has not done anything, like literally probably is unplayable even, but maybe just because no one has tried it. Vanadium has been doing okay-ish. Gold Pride has been doing okay-ish, getting a top here and there in Nationals. Flunder, top here and there. Tearlaments, top here and there. Marincess, top here and there. Dark World, tops nowhere. Purely, tops here and there. Sword Soul, tops here and there. So if anything, we have overestimated some of these decks down here. Maybe we put some respect on Sky Strikers by putting them into tier 2 after their remote dual YCS top as well. I don't think it makes a big difference between tier 2 and tier 3 for most of these decks. Vanquish Soul is a deck that I would still settle relatively high in tier 2. And this is honestly the part where I feel like we don't have to change as much about this tier list. Just a couple words about these decks up here on what I think about these. We're not going to talk about every single deck individually, but at least the first 2 rows we can quickly talk about. Kashtira, I think, is in a very solid spot right now. The deck is good. My issues with Kashtira is I don't think the mirror match is super good. I also think the deck is obviously expected by a lot of people. It feels like you're playing non-engine roulette, where you're really hoping they don't have that talent, or they don't have this or that, or because you get even lead or whatever, you really need to hope that you have some solid hand traps to back it up. I'm not a huge fan of Kashtira myself, but it is a very strong deck, so I can't deny that. Evil Twin Runic Sprite has just been performing very solid. It's just a very solid deck. The deck is relatively hard to pilot, I would say, similar for for the Furhire Runic Sprite. Like, I've seen a lot of people at Nationals who have not been piloting this deck to its fullest extent, to the full potential. I've seen people make mistakes with this that costed them games, costed them the top cut, costed them whatever. I would say the Runic Sprite variations are the second best deck in the format right now, behind Kashtira for sure. I personally even prefer them over Kashtira, but that is me personally. Labyrinth has had kind of this up and down kind of swingy thingy. Like, initially, I thought Labyrinth was going to be really good. And then Labyrinth didn't end up performing at some nationals. Like, I believe it was the French National Championship where I believe it was no Labyrinth that topped in 64, which was like horrible. And then it won German nationals all of a sudden. It's just kind of been going up and down. It's just kind of like sometimes people respect it and they really prepare for it, and then it doesn't perform, and then people stop respecting it, and then it starts performing again. Maybe it also just needs some really good players, right? Because I know at German nationals, some people that played Labyrinth were just really good Labyrinth players. I think it really goes to show, like, especially if you look at the first game of the finals of German nationals, it's like the deck is also not just flip Floodgate and win. It's not as simple as that with Labyrinth. So maybe it also just takes a good Labyrinth player. But I would still say Labyrinth is probably here or here. Maybe you could argue these two decks have shown more consistency than Labyrinth, because those two decks have always been performing pretty much, whereas the Labyrinth deck hasn't. Also, yes, if that makes you happy, we can move Exosister to tier 3 because they were able to beat Adignister in the remote duel YCS. Other than that, like I said, the Furhire Runic deck I think is pretty strong, but it's not for everyone. Melfi Sprite is a very solid pick right now. Melfi Sprite is kind of like Kashtira in the sense that it has a strong engine and it can play a lot of non-engine. Its engine, I think, is a little bit weaker than Kashtira, but the deck is not as targeted, but that's that. Branded, I'm gonna say it, I've been disappointed by Branded in the recent tournaments. It's just never been performing great in the big nationals. I don't think Branded is a top tier deck, but I think it is strong enough if people start disrespecting it. Like, if you look at German nationals, for example, there was one Branded in top 32. The same picture was in other nationals, right? You didn't see that much Branded actually doing so well. So I think maybe we are at the point where people are like, I don't have to play Ashe anymore. Maybe I don't have to respect anymore. Maybe I don't have to side a D barrier anymore. Stuff like that. Maybe if we reach that point, Branded could be benefiting from that. Rika, I think, is a solid pick. I personally am not a fan of Rika because to me it feels like a deck that is really good at going first and really mediocre at going second. That's just my personal experience with Rika as well. Like, I've had problems against Rika when they went first. I haven't had problems when I got to go first. Out of all these decks here, it's the most dice roll dependent. Makes me personally not want to use it, but I think it's fair if you want to. Rika is the balls to the wall combo deck of the format after Super Heavy died? Kind of. I think it's kind of that. More than Lab? I think so, yeah, because some decks make a board where Lab can just set 5 and be okay. Rika against certain decks, if you don't have the Dark Ruler or you don't have the Evenly, you straight up can't play. And Rika also bricks a fair amount. It just doesn't have that many locais actually. D-Link is in this very weird spot where D-Link is actually quite good against every deck in the format except for Kashtira. While that is actually quite good, like, the deck is just straight up nice against like 70% of the decks. Unfortunately, your one bat matchup turns out to be the most popular deck of the format. So that's kind of unfortunate. The deck is not that good against Labyrinth either, but it's a fine matchup, especially if you go first, because you also don't really care about goes in match, which is like the #1 floodgate in Labyrinth right now, next to Skildrin, of course, which everyone cares about. The deck is good against Life Twin Runic Sprite. It's not great against Furhire Runic Sprite because they don't lose to Bestials as hard, but yeah. And that's my take on the top decks currently in the meta, their pros and cons. From our initial evaluation of the format, I think we got close. I think we did okay. Now, let's talk about what I said about hand traps and board breakers in the beginning of the format. Let's just start with hand traps. I will say, I think hand traps are in a very weird spot right now. And I also think that this is relatively close to what I was saying in the beginning of the format. So I said Ashe and Imperm are good, and Shifter, if your deck can play it, is also good. And I think that is true. I think the decks that want to play some hand traps, they pretty much always start with Ashe and Imperm in this format. And then some decks like Kashtira, they can play Shifter. Now, I will say, with Kashtira being the top dog in the format pretty much, some people have been moving Shifter to the side deck, which I can understand. I can get behind it. It depends what you value more. Like, do you want a better mirror match if you're playing Kashtira, or do you want a better rogue matchup? It's close. matchups, I think it's fine to main deck Shifter. I think it's also fine to side deck Shifter because you're scared of the mirror match, because drawing Shifter in the mirror doesn't feel great. But I would say these three up here are like the only hand traps that feel genuinely good overall. The others down here, I would say Droll probably is the one that's the least situational. Nib, I want to say a few things about Nib because I ended up playing Nibiru because I specifically wanted to be able to beat Kashtira, and also the branded lock that goes for the Sanctifier, I believe also plays into Nibiru most of the time. I was a little scared of that, and that's why I decided to play Nibiru. But overall, I am not convinced by Nibiru because the card is basically, it's kind of the opposite of Shifter, where it's only really good against Kashtira, because the thing is people are playing into Nib with Kashtira, most of them, which is fair because Nib is not that popular. If you're looking for a hand trap that is specifically good against Kashtira, Nibiru is kind of it. But in other decks, like specifically all the sprite variations, Nibiru is typically very easy to be played around. So I will keep Nib in the situational category. I'll move it like down here. Now, Droll, Bell, and Bystials are all three solid in this format. They are more likely to be good in the side deck than the main deck, though. That's why I put them in this category, and I think it remains that way. I'm a huge fan of Bystials. I think they are great in a lot of matchups and in a lot of decks. I would never main deck them unless you're playing something like Dragon Link, where they are part of your engine. They are phenomenal in a lot of matchups. Like, they are really good against Life Twin Runic Sprite. They are nice against Branded. I just love Bystials in a lot of different matchups. I've been siding them a lot in most of my decks. Droll Lockbird is a card that if you want to main deck it, I think you can. It's kind of like a high risk, high reward kind of card. Sometimes it's going to be great, sometimes it's going to be awful. There's just a couple games where your opponent goes activate Prosperity, add Kashtira field spell. In situations like that, Droll Lockbird just feels so powerful. But then there's games where your opponent goes special summon Unicorn first action, activate it to add Theosis. And in those cases, the Droll Lockbird doesn't feel that great because they get to look at your extra deck and they still get to end on some stuff. Or yeah, sometimes Prosperity chain Shifter and then Droll Lockbird is completely dead, right? And so high risk, high reward card, not necessarily wrong to play it though. Bell, basically it's just too situational to be main decked because it's not great against Cash and it's not great against Pure Sprite, but it is a phenomenal side deck card because it's really good against Labyrinth to stop Big Welcome. It works against Branded too, stops you from getting Puppet locked or whatever, stops the Branded in red if they go for that. Card is okay against Runic decks. Card is actually pretty good against Furhire Runic because of Donner. Bell is nice. Retaliating C, I played it at German Nationals. I feel like I overrated it a little bit. It was a little bit worse than I thought it would be, but I still think it's an okay card in like Runic matchups and Branded matchup. And then Contact C, I threw it in here, but the only reasoning is that I think you can, if you play Retaliating C, I think it is maybe fine to play one Contact C just to get the free search. That's the context behind the Contact C. Like, I don't think I would play just Contact C. And then Veiler, Mourner, and Crow have all been okay, in my opinion. Most of the time you are better off just playing some board breakers instead, but they are not bad. The stuff down here I still think hasn't changed. I don't think anything here has surprised me as actually good card. I think we can leave it at that. Yeah, besides just moving around some of the stuff in the situational category, I think on the hand traps, I feel like my advice was relatively spot on in the beginning. It turned out that the format was relatively close to what I thought it would be. And then board breakers, I think we have a little bit more to change here. I think evenly talents and also thrust should be in the very good category, and maybe even Dark Ruler No More, because Dark Ruler No More has seen a lot more main deck play than I thought it would. Maybe in this case we should really rename this category to good, because Fenrir has been solid, and I'm talking Fenrir in everything that isn't Kashtira, because of course Fenrir is phenomenal in Kashtira, but I'm talking about Fenrir and other decks. Fenrir and other decks in this format has been okay in my opinion. I've been liking it in some decks, but I've also not seen it perform incredibly well. It's great in Vanquish Soul. I will keep Kurikara here, even though Kurikara is relatively strong against the current iteration of Kashtira. Specifically against Kashtira, I think Kurikara is a phenomenal card right now because their opener just really plays into it, and it's their only Arise Heart that you're tributing. Kurikara has been great. Change of Heart hasn't really seen any play. The same goes for Super Poly. Lightning Storm and Duster are good. The books, I think, move up a little bit basically because when I made this tier list, I expected Kashtira to still be a thing, but I didn't expect it to be that big of a deal. Super Poly is fine in Labyrinth, but if it's only in one deck, I don't know if I would call that an overall good board breaker. It still is a decent card. Your guys are acting like I'm throwing it into a terrible never play this card category, but for most decks, Super Poly isn't that great, especially because a lot of the decks in the current format have like at least some issue with extra deck space, like all the sprite variations. One other main concern that I have with Super Poly is that if Kashtira makes its standard board of Shangri-Ira, Arisard, Fenrir, you cannot Super Poly that. That is specifically my problem with Super Polymerization, is that the standard Kashtira board can't be Super Polyed, and that's kind of awful. That's kind of like the one matchup where you want your board breaker to be good if you're playing one, right? I'm gonna move up Darkhole over Raigeki. Darkhole has seen some experimentation because Ibli has been somewhat popular, not super popular. Ibli is not like everywhere. I personally still don't think Ibli is very good right now, so that's why some people have been choosing to play Darkhole, which I think is fine. I think it's okay for you to do that. So Darkhole probably a little bit underestimated. Droplet is in a weird spot where, very similar to some other cards on this list, it is very good against a lot of decks except for the damn Arisard. That goddamn Arisard, right? So I'm gonna throw Droplet in decent because it is very good in a lot of matchups other than Kashtira. So you have two options. You can say, screw it, I'm still gonna main deck Droplet because it's very good in other matchups, and I'm just gonna accept the fact that it's a dead draw if I go second against Kashtira, which that's fair enough. You can do that. Or you can decide to side deck the drop and just put it in the matchups where you really want it. Now, as a side deck card for going second, I am not sure that Droplet is better than Dark Ruler. I think Dark Ruler is probably better because it has less cost attached to it. Droplet is also a fair option in the side deck though. It does some stuff that Dark Ruler doesn't. Like, for example, you can answer the Albion the Sanctifier Dragon with Droplet. It outs Ibli as well. You can chain it to anti-spell. There is some arguments why Droplet would be better in the side deck than Dark Ruler. Overall, I think Droplet is good or decent because of Kashtira. The other cards I want to revisit a little bit are Lava Golem and Sphere Mode. I put them in mediocre. I don't even know why I did that. The only reason I can think of why I put Lava Golem and Sphere Mode into mediocre is that I didn't really know which deck to put them in. And that is to an extent still the case. Like, if we're talking about Labyrinth and Kashtira, those cards have been solid, so maybe I should move them up here. But based on the fact that only those two decks can really play them, I don't even know which other decks other than Labyrinth and Kashtira can play those cards. So maybe it's just a decent overall. And then based on the fact that this card hasn't seen any play, I'm going to move Ultimate Slayer down, sadly. So this seems more appropriate now. I think I feel more comfortable with this than what I had previously. I think the board breaker tier list out of the three was the one where we did underestimate a couple of cards and we overestimated a couple of cards, mainly underestimating. I am pleasantly surprised by the performance of Thrust, Dark Ruler, Books, Droplet, Darkhole, Lava Golem, Sphere Mode. I think it was mostly underestimation on my part. That's why it's good to revisit this stuff, because maybe you've excluded a certain card in your considerations at the beginning of the format, and then you come back and you realize, hey, this card wasn't that bad. Maybe it's worth thinking about. Santa Claus in bad, why? I think Santa Claus is worse than a Kaiju. The only reason to play Santa Claus was purely. If you're playing Go Second purely, you can still play Santa Claus. I think I am going to turn this into a YouTube video. So if you've been watching this on YouTube, let me know if this was helpful. Let me know if we should do this more often in the future, if we keep doing tier lists like that. Let me know if this helps you prepare for your upcoming events. And yeah, thank you for watching, and, you know, subscribe, all the good stuff, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.